I remember going to see Tan Sri Lim. He said he does not hire consultants. I don't hire consultants, Idris. So I told him, this time round, I'm going to give you an offer. Put a target net income after tax that you have never achieved before, and I will put my team for the whole year to work with you to achieve the target. And if we don't help you to achieve the target, pay us nothing. He looked at me.
Welcome to the Game of Impossible podcast. My name is Leon and this is my dad, Idris Jala. We are a father-son podcast where we discuss all things transformation through the lens of business, leadership, sport, and faith. Today, we are going to do a discussion that is a little bit more focused on leadership lessons from the Bible. We've often spoken about, quite vocally, about how we are both practicing Christians. You have had a very, you've maybe had quite an interesting story, a revival story that was transformative on a personal level for you. And for myself, I've had a similar experience, maybe slightly different in terms of how it looked, but which ultimately culminated in me working for the church full time. So I thought today it would be a good opportunity to focus a little bit more through the lens of faith, as we say in the intro of this podcast. I think first of all, to set the tone, I think it's worth defining what do we mean by transformation through the lens of faith. We have often talked about this in our live talks, setting the stage for transformation, and this idea that transformation really begins with the mind. You know, in Romans it says, "Be renewed by the renewing of your mind." Transformation starts there because that is where you have your being transformed, and then you have that being then inform your doing. So maybe we can start by looking at transformation at the level of the individual.
Even in the Quran also, he refers also the renewal of the mind.
Yeah, it says Allah will not change people until they change what is in their minds.
Correct.
So maybe we can talk about this lens of looking at transformation as the inner transformation of the individual. What are some lessons that we can learn from in the Bible or faith in general? And then how does that then apply in corporate life? And we also just want to be aware that there are viewers who are students as well. So thank you to our younger audiences who listen to this. How can this apply in the work that we do?
I think the first one in leadership is that whether you are running an organization or you are running a church or a university, the thing that is very important in leadership is to have a clear vision. And throughout the Bible, and it's been very, very clear, I think if you look very closely at the Quran too, God is very clear about his vision for mankind. In my mind, God's vision for mankind is that he wants people to come close to him, to become transformed into his likeness, and to be able to live a life that is meaningful and that is a purpose, to live in peace, and so have an eternal communion with him through eternity. So I think that is a very simple idea that God is so clear that he wants us to do that. So if you're not clear about, you and I talk about in the context of true north, if you are not clear about your true north, not clear about your vision, what you intend to do, in leadership, you're going to lead the organization to be quite confused about what the focus is. So God is, I think, very clear about what his visions are for mankind. And in those descriptions that I described.
Yeah, and there's a very practical reason for that as well. I mean, even if there are people who are listening to this who are not religious or not spiritual in the way that they see life, actually there's a huge importance of having a sense of a true north, because we've talked about this before, but you know, it's in our very design. We have this thing called the reticular activating system, this network of neurons that is literally capable of shaping our actions towards the thing that our mind is set on. So I think knowing that if you are able to then have a clear sense of true north or clear sense of vision, then obviously with that, your actions are going to naturally follow suit as well. and head towards that direction. Now, if you want to take it a step further, then from a Christian standpoint, then we will say, well, if we're already capable of achieving that, even by purely secular, non-religious means, how much better then would it be if you orient or direct or anchor your true north or that sense of vision towards the embodiment of a perfect vision, the perfecter and completer of that perfect vision as well, which is God or Jesus in our case. So I think that's important, having a true sense of vision. How has that maybe played out for you? And I want to now go into this section because maybe this would be a good time for you to share your revival story.
Yeah.
What did that look like? Tell us a bit about that.
It happened in October 1973. We were preparing for our Form 3 exams. And so I remember inviting my good friend Osat to come to our house so that we prepare for our exams. And so we studied the Bible while we were doing our revision. And also we did a little bit of prayer in between. And as we were doing that day after day, and I realized that we were reading more and more of the Bible and less of geography and English and history and etc. and other subjects. I can't even remember which particular day it was, but we had a spiritual encounter. We both were on our knees repenting to God for our sins, and we were crying our hearts out. We felt the presence of God in that room. And we were crying. I can't remember how long we were crying, but it was so unnatural. We promised never to tell anyone about it because it was so unnatural. I kind of felt, Leon, that a huge load was lifted out from my shoulders, and that was his experience too. On that weekend, we went to the Christian fellowship amongst the students. What we didn't realize was the experience we had was common among the other students. They had a very similar experience, but we all didn't know it was happening to us individually. And so it culminated in the afternoon when we're having the Christian fellowship. And Reverend now, our teacher, Solomon Bolan, who was our teacher, he was in charge of that fellowship. And he wrote a book called the Bario Revival, and he's now a reverend. But really what had happened was, it's almost like we all had individual small fires in our hearts. And these fires had ignited and connected amongst each other, and it became a huge conflagration, if you use the terminology to describe it. And everyone had this spiritual encounter. And so from then on, that little encounter it spread into the village, and we went out preaching. I remember I walked for almost 5 days in the jungle to Osat's village to preach, and we were 15-year-old kids. Yeah? We didn't know much about the Bible. My sister walked for a week to Long Lelang, and the other kids walked. We all walked to other villages to preach, like in the old days, what happened to the apostles.
And prior to this, you had never preached before.
Oh, I never
it's
preached
not
before.
That you guys were
No.
trained
No.
to preach. It was just you were suddenly almost given this supernatural ability to be able to do
Supernatural ability.
that.
And I remember when we were preaching, Leon, it was not a very cerebral and persuasive way of preaching like what people do with lots of Bible quotations and preaching solid sermons. We were just reading the Bible, reading a verse or two in the Bible and praying, and people were accepting Christ. They were on their knees repenting for the forgiveness. That period, 1973 and 1974, Leon, as a result of that revival, there's so many people who are in Christian terminology born again. They accepted Christ as their Savior. And people who had broken marriages had reconciled. People who had land disputes, they settled their land disputes. Family conflicts, they were resolved. A lot of things were happening during that time. I would say if there was one moment, 1 year that I can recall, closest resemble what heaven would look like in Bario, that was the period 1973, 1974.
So that was obviously quite a supernatural experience, and in the books of the annals of history, when you look at revivals, then that would probably be one of the more supernatural or spectacular incidences of revival. You have that one, and then even the revival in Baklalan, also very, very spectacular, if not maybe slightly more spectacular.
Even more, yeah.
A lot of interesting phenomenon that was happening there. But growing up, hearing these stories, I found that for me personally, as amazing as the story was, I felt actually for me that was a little bit of a turn off. And then the reason for that is because I felt that to experience revival is to experience something at that kind of a height, that level of the spectacular. So there was almost this sense of, if I could not experience something like that, does that mean that the Holy Spirit, or that I had not encountered the Holy Spirit, or maybe I was not one of the sort of select few, or if you like, a Christian elite to experience the power of God in that way. And so I personally struggled with this idea of revival, because I always felt that revival had to look a certain way. But what's interesting is, over the years, as I have thought about it, and even if I look back to that story of revival, and if you look at other stories of revival as well, actually what is more interesting is not so much the mechanics of what happened during the revival, but rather actually what were the real implications and outcomes from it. So like what you shared earlier, real outcomes were you guys were going around preaching to people, and out of that, going village to village preaching to people, you said that people were healed, the sick were healed, there were relationships that were restored as well. So there's a real practical implication. But then even if you look out after that, like what you didn't mention is that was during a period where all of you were supposed to be studying for exams.
We weren't studying at all.
And obviously there was no studying happening, but quite amazingly,
it's the best exam results in that school to this day, actually.
Exactly. So then there comes another real practical outcome, a real practical fruit out of that revival is academic excellence. But even out of that, if you look at that, you look at your revival cohort, many of you have gone on to be very influential in different fields of influence, whether some in ministry, like you mentioned earlier, as in church ministry, but then people in corporate work and in the public sector as well. So there is real fruit, and I think this is important because in the church we've been thinking a lot about how do we invest and understand the emerging generations. And so, as I was scrolling through IG one day, I saw this post by a Christian. He's a Christian Gen Z advocate. He himself is not a Gen Z, but he's very passionate about investing in the next generation. And his post says that Gen Z has a different view of revival. And then in this post, he goes out to list out what revival looks like to emerging generations. Gen Z's view of revival is not a 5-hour-long worship service. It's serving the poor, needy, and broken. It's being the hands and feet of Jesus. It's the gospel applied. It's the truth revealed. It's tangible freedom, not just a fuzzy feeling. It's the gospel lived out beyond a great worship moment. It's high character in tough moments. It's scripture understood and changing lives. So in all that we do, in our transformational pursuits, I think the real litmus test of whether this is something worthwhile pursuing is it going to have a practical impact and outcome to those around us, whether it's for our teams, whether it's for our clients or our customers. So I think that is important to note. And that is directly learned from the Bible as well. There's nothing in the Bible that is purely a spiritual gift for spiritual gift's sake. If we look at the list of spiritual gifts as well, they are all things that lean towards work. We were just chatting before we started recording this that sometimes we can have this impression that maybe work was not always in God's original plan for mankind. Some people might say, work only came about because in the garden, Adam and Eve ate the apple which they shouldn't have eaten, and because of that we now toil in the fields, as it says in Genesis. But actually, if you think about it, it was even before that work was ordained, and God himself modeled it in creation. both how to work, but then also how to do that with rest as well. A holistic approach to working well. So work is good, but then how can we apply excellence in the things that we do? I think the next section that would be worth going into then is, okay, we've talked about transformation at the individual level. We've talked about outcomes as well, and how do you then discern and define what is a worthwhile transformational pursuit or transformational vision to pursue? Now let's talk about what can we learn from the Bible in terms of how to lead well. We talk about this third lens of transformation as looking around. If the first was looking in, the next was looking out, then the third thing is looking around us. I truly believe that real transformation is only able to scale at the rate in which we love and care for those around us. And so you have often been a big advocate for Nehemiah. You've always used Nehemiah as a reference point in your leadership approach. Tell us a little bit about Nehemiah and why has he inspired you so much?
Yeah, I consider Nehemiah, the book of Nehemiah, it's the MBA of the Bible. And to your point, Leon, I mean, the centerpiece of a lot of what's inside there is the collaboration with others, what you call looking around. Nehemiah, right from the beginning, he was a cupbearer to the king of Persia, and he asked for permission from the king so that he allowed him the license to travel to Jerusalem to build a wall. He also asked for permission so that they get timber along the way, safety and etc. When he reached that place, he got everybody in Jerusalem to collaborate with him to build a wall. And they did all the planning required. They did all the resource mobilization. They did everything that's to do with, they looked at the need that's required from the wall, where the gaps were in the wall and what kind of material was required to fix it. The planning was detailed and meticulous. The material and resources required was completely ready. And in Nehemiah is also resistance to change. Because in the Nehemiah, there is the Sanballat, the people were resisting it, and they had to deal with crisis management, how to deal with that at the same time. And so I believe it was because the way in which he did this idea of collaborating with the winning collaboration with so many people, it is for that reason that they were able to rebuild the city wall within 52 days. I mean, when you think about it, we went and had a look at that Jerusalem, how big that place was. We imagined that you were rebuilding the wall, and I cannot imagine that you were just doing it the conventional approach. You will not be able to bring it to pristine condition in 52 days. But if you read the book of Nehemiah, the interesting thing is this, Leon. You could say it's one of the most boring books in the Bible because line after line, pages after pages are names of people who built the city wall.
What's the significance
of that? And the significance is he's giving credit to them. Everyone who was involved in doing them, he put the names of those people who built the city wall. And what he did was accountability. The family who lived next to that wall, he assigned them to be the ones to build the city wall based on the specification. So it's obviously if you live just next to the city wall, you want to make sure that your wall is provide the right protection. And so there's accountability to it. So him giving the names of all those people who build it by names is giving credit to them. Giving credit. A lot of people in the corporate world, they don't give credit to the team members who are doing it.
Right.
But Nehemiah, it makes it crystal clear, he put the names. Into my own experience, Leon, if you look at our economic transformation program that we developed in 2010, at the end of that book, we put the names of the 500 people who were involved in developing the economic transformation program because they were the ones inside the lab. And I was inspired by Nehemiah, giving credit for every single one of those people who were involved by listing their names, just like it's been done in the Bible. That's giving credit where credit's due.
Yeah, and I mean, a real mark of an effective leader is actually a leader who is secure in his or her identity. And I think one of the biggest signs of an insecure leader is a leader who is unable or unwilling to give credit to others. And I think personally, I have been guilty of this in my early stages of leadership. And sometimes I still have to remind myself, even today, because obviously the natural tendency is obviously maybe in a ministry context, everyone is a bit more conditioned to think like this in a church ministry context. But if you go then into like a corporate environment, then it's naturally a bit more competitive. So you would naturally feel that in that kind of an environment, wouldn't it be better to look after my own interest? If something has gone well, it would be better to consolidate all of the praise in my direction. But I think what I've realized is actually by doing the converse, the flip of it, even though it feels unnatural, what that has done is actually that has helped to move things even further. Because if you begin to honor those around you, even if it's not necessarily just people in your team, but even if you honor, let's say, a client who's contributed a good idea to a project. I used to work in advertising, and sometimes some ideas actually come from the clients, and those are actually ideas that really help to move a particular campaign along. Actually, by giving credit, that simple act of giving credit and recognition actually helps them to feel a little bit more bought in on the things that we are trying to do. And I think when we have teams around us that have real skin in the game and have a real desire to want to achieve the impossible, to achieve big, fast results, not because they've simply been told to do it, but because they personally feel that what they do has meaning to it, they're going to give it their 110% without as much input and guidance needed from you. And I think when you continue to do that over time, that is essentially how something scales. I think if I look back at how I was maybe leading teams before, when it was a bit more me-focused, things would do well, but nowhere near as at that sort of rate and scale as maybe things that I'm doing today, where a lot of power, a lot of authority is actually relinquished and distributed to different team members. So there's a real beauty in doing that. I think the next thing I want to ask you then is honoring each other. Like what does that actually look like in a Christian context? Because maybe sometimes we can have in church circles maybe a skewed understanding of what this actually looks like. And I guess the simple question is, does that mean that does it simply mean we just need to be nice people?
Yeah. I mean, the term that is used a lot in the Christian circle that is not normally used in the corporate world is this thing called servant leadership, because it stems from Jesus bending down and wash the feet of the disciples. There's the idea of servant leadership. I think the centerpiece to that idea of servant leadership is this. There must be genuine focus on the interests of the others before yours first. And if you start to do that, and people think that you're authentic, that you're interested in their interests, they're more likely you could win their hearts and minds in the stuff that you're doing. So I think the idea of servant leadership is to put the others and you become the servant to serve them. And of course, if you look at Nehemiah, it's quite unlike the big folks like in the Bible, like Moses, they become larger-than-life characters. Abraham was larger than life. Isaac was larger than life. David was larger than life. But Nehemiah is almost somebody that is almost disappeared. I mean, so even the task that he did he was not building a corporate empire for himself. He didn't do it. He just wanted to build a city wall for everybody. So if you like, the guy is an epitome of servant leadership in that sense. He was there to tell them the whole city wall had collapsed, and I want us to work together to build this wall for all of us. And people knew that was a good thing, that it was not in his self-interest. And he didn't become a hero in the Bible as a result of this. It was just that everybody was involved. And the very act of putting the names of those people who helped to build a city wall, if I will almost catapult the idea, jettison the idea that the others were more important than him. And so he didn't appear to me as someone that really put himself, his ego, on top of the pedestal. because it was the task itself was for the community to begin with.
Yeah.
And he was doing it for everybody rather than for himself. Because if he wanted to do it for himself, he probably said, let's build a city wall in my area first and build and fortify that area. He didn't do that. He did it for everybody, and they all did in parallel. I think the idea of servant leadership must begin with an authentic and genuine focus on the interests of others before yours. And if you do that, that's a starting point.
Yeah.
And of course, sometimes if you want the interest of others for them to grow, sometimes giving them critical and tough messages in the hope that they will be able to grow as a result of it is part of servant leadership, because that's the interest of the person that's required. And like when if you're a doctor, you ask the question provocatively, is a medical doctor who had diagnosed a patient and said, your condition is so severe that you cannot be healed by using simple medication such as Panadol. We need to do a surgery for you. If the doctor is genuinely putting the interest of the patient on the core, if the surgery is what's required, painful as it may get, hard as it may be a message, that is a message that must be given to the patient so that the patient will accept the painful surgery that's required, that they have to go through. I mean, that I think is, to me, I would consider that to be tough message, but it is soft on the people because that's genuinely what is required. And I think it's the manner in which you communicate with them. If they genuinely know that their interest is on the pedestal, then they will accept the message and they will also accept the consequences of the actions that need to be taken alongside.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a very good distinction to draw, because I think sometimes the idea of servant leadership can be, because some people will say, well, servant leadership is all fair and good in a church ministry context, but surely it can't be taken lock, stock and barrel in a corporate context. But as you rightly pointed out, to have a posture of servant leadership does not necessarily mean that we have to be at the beck and call of our teams, because, like you mentioned, the true north of servant leadership actually is a posture of wanting to raise and release those under our care.
Yeah.
And sometimes, in order to do that, in order to facilitate growth, you do need to have difficult conversations in play.
Yeah.
I think sometimes the challenge can be when in a church environment, we mistake that for just being nice.
Yeah.
And actually, in the pursuit of trying to be nice all the time, we actually stand in the way of good feedback that could help other people grow. And because of that, we don't have that debrief that we maybe should have had about that event or about that campaign, or maybe we don't have that more difficult conversation with maybe someone who either didn't deliver on something or maybe wasn't conducting themselves in a way that was in line with maybe some of our values. I think we discount or we prevent people from growing when we have that idea of grace.
True. I want to jump in here when you talk about the word nice, being collegial. I mean, I want to relate the story about the parable of the talents. When this is to bring the whole point of accountability in leadership. And this parable of the talents is told by none other than Jesus himself. And he says, there were 3 servants, and the master, he was going on holiday, so he took 5 talents and gave it to one of the servants. And he gave 2 talents. Talents is a form of currency at that time. So he gave 2 talents to another servant, and he gave 1 to another servant. And he told them, go and invest this, go and multiply this, and when I return from holiday, tell me what you have done with them. And so when he came back, the master, he asked the servants to come and see him. The first servant whom he gave 5 talents to, he multiplied them to 10. So the master said to the servant, well done, servant, you've served very well, and I commend you for it. Then he told him that he will share with me the joys of all this multiplication that you've had. The second servant, whom he gave 2, multiplied it by doubling it to become 4. But the last servant, he replied to the master, Master, you are very hard man. I knew that, and I was very worried that if I went to invest it, if I lost it, you would give me a very hard time. And so what I did was I buried him. So I'm now returning to you the one talent that you gave. I did not multiply it. So of course, the master punished him for it. He actually took the talent and gave it to the servant that had 5, who multiplied to 5. And he took the servant and threw him into the wolves. And so accountability, this is very tough message. So accountability is so crystal clear inside here. So work is relating to accountability, and consequences follow with it. So these are tough messages. And the master had told the servant that you had failed in your responsibility in terms of good stewardship. So this idea of the talents is a message about stewardship, responsibility and accountability and consequence management. And so I think this is very, very important. And of course, the other part was, why did the master give 5 to one, 2 to another? And this is because of their capability. He then provided the gifts based on the capabilities of those people and the resources and ability. So that's also part of how to put responsibilities on people that you think they are going to do a lot more with it, and plus others. So I do believe that these nice things, sometimes you have to be direct in your language so that people understand exactly what it comes to. When it comes to accountability, to me, there should not be any fuzzy around it. You shouldn't fuzz it. Accountability must be crystal clear what the task is, what the expectations are, what the incentives are, and what the consequences are for not delivering based on that as well.
Well, I mean, you could argue that some of the things that even Jesus did and the way that he responded to certain people,
the Pharisees,
not necessarily paint Jesus as a nice guy. If you were to look at the act alone, I mean, like flipping the tables outside the temples, rebuking one of his disciples, Peter, by saying, "Get behind me, Satan."
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that those are nice words to hear, but the spirit behind it.
Yeah.
He was flipping the tables. It was because he was upset that the temple was being desecrated. There wasn't a sense of reverence for God because people were trading outside the temple.
Yeah.
For Peter as well, it was obviously because he wanted to, like a parent maybe reprimanding a child, doing it out of love.
Yeah.
And I think love it's a very important thing. It sounds kind of fuzzy to talk about in terms of team dynamics, but what I find interesting is that if you look at Romans 12, verse 10, one of Paul's instructions is to be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. And I think why is this important? The context to this is he's writing this letter. He's writing this letter to the church in Corinth, the early church that would then go on to then multiply and become the Christianity that we know today. But why is this thing about love important? And I think it's because if we look back at any context, in a church context, in a corporate context, in the advent of any big project, you will notice that usually one of the first things to be at risk of breaking down is usually the unity. Unity with our clients, unity with our shareholders, or unity within our teams as well. And so I always like to think of it as, if we look at it in a spiritual sense, if we're looking at things from the standpoint of what does God want to do and then what does the enemy want to thwart. If, let's say, an opposing force that doesn't prevent you from doing the thing that you want to achieve, but actually doubles down on the thing you want to achieve, but then causes infighting within that environment. That is when actually we become most at risk of not achieving the things that we set out to achieve. And that's why I think Paul put so much emphasis on this idea of loving one another. Because again, if we take all that we've spoken about earlier, transformation really only is able to scale at the rate in which we love one another.
Absolutely.
Because if we love the other, then we are going to be more ready to give praise where needed and encouragement. We'll be more ready to also relinquish control and power where appropriate as well. But at the same time, we'll also be more willing to then be able to give them feedback where required, feedback in the interest of their growth, all underpinned by love for the other. So I think that's really important. Now, we talk a lot about situational leadership, and you kind of touched on it there just now, because you talked about competency.
Right.
You were giving that example of the talents, but where do we maybe see other examples of this sense of situational leadership?
Right. Yeah, that classic example is this, the Exodus. When Moses led his people from Egypt to the promised land, the beginning part of the journey, Moses' style of leadership was highly directive. And obviously, he was not having a democratic discussion with everybody which direction in the desert they were going to head towards. He just told them, God told me that I was going to lead all of you to leave Egypt so that we get to the promised land. And so follow me. He didn't have a democratic discussion. If they did, they would have never left Egypt, because he didn't have no GPS, there's no map. And so when they went out to do that, it was obviously directive style during the phase 2, which is normally called the dissatisfaction phase. And people were very unhappy because they were lost in the desert for a very long time. And so they didn't have all the things, the trappings, what they had, the kind of food that they had in Egypt. So they were complaining about it. But of course, the style of leadership is empathy, but still directive. Because he cannot go and tell them, I understand what you are saying, now let's return to Egypt. So the point was, let's push on, but let's find a way how to resolve some of the issues that we have here. And then the third stage in the journey of transformation is called the resolution stage. It is at this resolution stage that the people, the Israelites who were following Moses at the time, they have developed competencies. They know how to deal with being in the desert for that period of time. So a lot of the issues were resolved. So the style in leadership now need to change from being directive to more empowering. And so because they were already competent, they could do many things. The final stage is called the production stage. That means they are really delivering results. And people know a lot more how to take on the journey instead of the original leader, which is Moses. In this stage, Moses had to learn to let go, start to empower completely. That means he then handed over the baton to Joshua. It was Joshua that led the people to promised land rather than Moses himself. So the point about that was this. In leadership, we must be ambidextrous. That means we must be prepared to, right at the beginning of the journey, to be directive. And then as the journey progresses towards a lot more people being competent in the journey, that leadership must learn to let go and must learn to empower and groom other leaders to succeed themselves. So the best leaders are those that will groom leaders so that they themselves become redundant. And this is what happened in the case of Moses. He was basically redundant because Joshua was able to take on the baton from him and run with it, and he was the one that led to promised land.
Yeah, I always laugh at this quote by the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu, who says that a leader is most effective when people barely know that he or she exists. But I think sometimes you can look at something like that and think, well, isn't that just an excuse to be lazy? But actually, I think it's the opposite, because, obviously you work yourself towards redundancy. But
absolutely.
the key word here is work, because in order to get to that level, you have to have put in the guardrails. So you would have had to, if we use that situational leadership model, first model that by being very directive, setting the direction, and maybe to some degree potentially micromanaging as
Yeah,
well, that creating a bit of that kind of environment, but then eventually then raising people and monitoring and making sure that they're at a level where they're ready to be released in the things that they're doing. So there's a work required to
Absolutely.
get there. You don't just take that stance of I don't want people to know that exists from the very beginning, because otherwise nothing happens. Like you just become an invisible and a useless leader by doing that. Maybe to close, we've talked about transformation looking in, we've talked about transformation looking out, transformation looking around, more of this kind of teamwork, collaboration stuff. And then the final thing is transformation looking up. I think in order for us to play a long game in our transformational pursuits, I think we also have to be able to accept things that are outside of our control, because there will be a lot of things that are outside of our control. And so as Christians, then for us, I think one of the ways that we do that is through prayer.
Yeah.
Because in times of prayer, then that is our communication with God. It's two ways. We listen, we hear from Him by reading Scripture, but then we also communicate through prayer. And there's something very powerful about prayer, because words received can change us, but it's the words that are then spoken which help to catalyze that change. Maya Angelou said that words are things you must be careful. They get on the walls, they get in your wallpaper, they get in your rugs, in your upholstery and your clothes, and finally in you. Now, I used to be a copywriter, and so I strongly believe in the power of words. I mean, we have seen wars started and ended just through words, sometimes just written words. So I think even if you're listening to this and there are people who are not religious, I think there is something in just a regular practice of speaking well over either yourself or speaking well over other people as well. It sort of closes the loop, because then we go back to returning to what is our true north.
Yeah.
So we set a true north. We do all of these. We have all of these action steps to make sure that gets translated into the results. We have all of the systems to make sure we're looking after our teams well. But we also have to constantly remind ourselves to speak life over ourselves on what that true north is. I mean, maybe you can share, how has that maybe looked like in your corporate career, or maybe in your personal life?
Yeah, I think it's very important for us to recognize that the world is not at our feet, that we're not in charge of everything in the world. So most of the time, if I look at my own life, Leon, so many things that happen to me, the things that happen to me are not exactly the way I planned for them. They didn't happen exactly the way they did because I caused them to happen. They happened the way they did. Now, the question is whether I was in charge, whether somebody else is in charge, whether it's luck, whether it's feng shui, whether it's fate. Obviously, in our case, and I always refer to it, God is in charge. So whether it's my God, whether it's a Muslim God or any other God, but I mean, we're not in charge of life. So when you talk about prayer is a very important human activity that connect us to the divine. So that is the way in which God speaks to them. So God speaks to us through the Bible. God speaks to us, to the Muslim, through the Quran. When we pray, that's the way we communicate to God, through our prayer. So I think we pray to God to give us providence, interventions for things that are outside our control. Because there's nothing you can do about things outside your control. And if it's really outside your control, there's really nothing you can do about that. And so you can only ask God to provide you providence so that the answers to your prayer is fulfilled based on God's will. So I've seen so many instances in my life where things work out the way they did. And not because I deserved them, but that was the way in which they did.
Yeah, and I think also, just as you were sharing that, to add to that, by surrendering to God, we are also then adopting, I think back to your point about servant leadership earlier, we're then adopting the posture of a student again, and not allowing ourselves to think that we have all of the answers. So if you're a Christian, then obviously then you are submitting all of your situations, your questions, and your leadership, everything, you're submitting that to God. But I think this also then applies in a secular context as well, because if you're not a religious person, then there is value in submitting to some sort of a mentor figure or a boss. You know, I think an effective leader is also someone who is able to be led by other people. You know, and so if there are people listening to this and you think, well, maybe this prayer thing doesn't really work for me, you know, other ways it can look like is it can look like speaking good and life-giving words over yourself, over your team, but it could also look like seeking wise counsel from someone who's a bit more senior, a bit more ahead in years than you.
Let me give you a real life story of what had happened and in divine intervention. Prior to the pandemic, for the first time, I've asked the team in PEMANDU, why don't we do something completely different that we've never done before? And I told the team, that was in the year 2019 it was, and 2018, identify 10 companies that are publicly listed and look at them, and then we pick on the basis of that one company, and where we will go to that company and tell them, we will help you on a no cure, no pay basis. So we looked at many companies and we narrowed it down to 10. I chose one. And the one that I chose was Top Glove. And the reason why I chose that, because the chairman, the founder, he wanted the company to become a Fortune 500 company by a certain particular year. So I like the ambition, the game with the impossible. So I said, let's go and try this. I remember going to see Tan Sri Lim. And so when we went to see him, he said he does not hire consultants. I don't hire consultants, Idris. So we do a thing by ourselves. So I told him, this time round, I'm going to give you an offer. Put a target net income after tax that you have never achieved before. And I will put my team for the whole year to work with you to achieve the target. And if we don't help you to achieve the target, pay us nothing. He looked at me, I have nothing to lose. Then he said, okay, on that basis, I agree to hire you guys. So we went and did the work. And we did the work for the whole period of almost a whole year, and then the pandemic came. But you all know the pandemic, the gloves were really in demand. And so, you know, our company, PEMANDU Associates, we lost all of our clients because our contracts were suspended or cancelled. And we have no work to do. And we had to pay redundancy. We had to cut our losses during the period. And it was because of this, the divine intervention is very clear. That had nothing to do with us. The profit of Top Glove was normally about 400 million per year or 300 million per year on a good day, 400. In that particular year, it jumped to 4 billion ringgit. And obviously, he negotiated for us not to get the full deal of the agreement because it was not entirely based on our...
Tell us what the original, what was the agreement? So that
the agreement was
no
this.
Cure, no pay.
No cure, no pay means...
So assuming we have the cure and the pay, then what was the
So
percentage?
if we help them to achieve that, they will give us much more than we would normally do if we were doing normal consultancy. There's a big reward associated with doing that. And so we negotiated downwards because the guy said, this is not really as a result of your doing. And of course, there was some as a result of our doing, but a lot of it truly ran runto. Leon, it was as a result of this that we then had enough money to tide the company during the period 2020 and 2021. It helped us in the way that we could pay the salaries and pay for redundancies, pay for all the things that's required. Otherwise, the company would have collapsed. Now, you asked me today, did I have the foresight about the pandemic in the year 2019? Absolutely no. And when I chose that, I had no idea that the pandemic was going to come. And that company that we chose was Top Glove. It's the number one glove company in the whole world. And obviously, the demand for the gloves was skyrocketing during that period. And I cannot attribute this to any other thing other than divine intervention. That's a classic example. And we needed that money to tide us during the period of 2021 and 2022. Yeah. And that has nothing to do with me, nothing to do with our team. That is God's intervention.
To close on the subject of divine intervention and divine wisdom, what would you What are you seeking divine wisdom for currently?
Sometime, Leon, I don't even know what to ask God. At that time, I had no idea what the divine intervention was required. I only said, God bless my team in the way that you think we deserve to be blessed. And that's my prayer at constant. And I don't actually put a demand for God for things that I want, and I want this and I want that. I don't have a list of things I want God to grant me. I only ask for bless me and my team in the way that we deserve to be blessed. And our role is to do the best we can. Our job is just to do the best we can on what we can control. And what is outside our control, I only ask God to bless me and the team to the level we should be blessed.
I think that's a good place to end today's episode. Thank you all for watching. Slightly different episode today, but really, really good one, and I think one that I think is meaningful to the both of us. For us to be able to speak of leadership, but through the lens of our Christian faith. So thank you for listening. We hope you've enjoyed it. If you haven't subscribed already, we encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube as well as our Spotify. We post long form on there every Friday at 6 a.m., but we also have short form content on both our IG as well as TikTok at The Game of Impossible. Thank you all for listening and for watching. We'll see you next week.